Welcome everyone to this webinar introducing HydroGeoSphere in the context of Integrated Hydrologic Modeling. My name is Ed Sudicky. I'm a professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Waterloo and a principal founder of Aquanti. I will do the introduction of the framework under which HydroGeoSphere is based, and my colleague here at Aquanti, Dr. Steve Frey, will provide some applications involving HydroGeoSphere that have been conducted over the past few years. So this is a diagram showing the terrestrial water cycle. It's the basic framework for which HydroGeoSphere was designed as a platform. You can see the various processes that are included here, ranging from, of course, it's driven by weather or climate forecast, precipitation, perhaps air temperature, solid precipitation in the form of snow. And of course, as the precipitation falls on the land surface, some of it may flow overland, supplying flow to a stream or a river. Some of it may infiltrate. And perhaps if the rainfall is intense enough, the infiltration will arrive at the water table, forming recharge, and then the groundwater system will feed the streams over time. In many parts of the world, it's important to include processes such as snow melt, soil freeze thaw. Of course, evapotranspiration is extremely important in many parts of the world, and these have all been included into HydroGeoSphere using a physics-based approach. So HydroGeoSphere is based on partial differential equations over the entire land surface. For water flow, we solve the 2D form of the diffusion wave equation. And in the subsurface, we solve the three-dimensional form of Richard's equation. So it is somewhat unique in the sense that we take a globally implicit approach and we solve these differential equations simultaneously at each time step. Now, we are interested in many cases not just in the movement and storage of water, but also for example, solute transport, groundwater contamination, etc., etc. So over the land surface, we solve the two-dimensional form of the advection dispersion equation, and in the subsurface, we solve the three-dimensional form of the advection dispersion equation under variably saturated conditions. Because the computational effort can be quite intense, we use state-of-the-art high-performance computing algorithms for both robustness and mass conservation. And over the years, we have implemented many advanced numerical techniques to solve the relevant equations. Just let me say a few words about Aquanti. Aquanti was founded in January of 2012 by the core developers of HydroGeoSphere. That includes me and my team at the University of Waterloo, Dr. Peter Forsyth, who is in the computer science department at the University of Waterloo, Dr. Renee Terrien, who is at Laval University in Quebec, a former PhD student of mine, completed in 1992, and we've continued to work together as a team over the years. Bob Leach is more than 35, probably 40 years of experience in the consulting business, and he serves on our board of directors. And the president and CEO of Aquanti is Dr. Steve Berg, who completed his PhD at the University of Waterloo a few years ago. Some of the other team include Dr. Youngjin Park, who was for many years a research scientist within my group at the university. He's now a principal developer at Aquanti. Dr. Hun-Tai Wang was a PhD student of mine that finished a few years ago, and he implemented the parallelization aspects of HydroGeoSphere. Dr. Steve Frey, who is here with me today, completed his PhD a number of years ago at the University of Waterloo under Dr. Dave Rudolph. Dr. Killian Miller joined us recently. He did his applied degree, a PhD in applied mathematics at the University of Waterloo, and he is implementing some new features into HydroGeoSphere for uncertainty analysis. And more recently, Dr. Mike Callahan, who completed his PhD at the University of Calgary, joined our team. Over the many years of our research lives at the university, we have collaborated with many of the world's leading scientists, and they are scientific associates within the Quanti team, so we make use of their expertise as needed. I'm sure many of you will recognize the names of many of them that are up on the screen, and basically with their inputs we can cover the scientific details of all aspects of the hydrologic cycle, including the climate system, movement through the unsaturated zone, contaminant transport, regional groundwater flow systems, etc. Now, as some of you may be aware, there was a classic paper published by Al Fries and a PhD student of his at the time, in which he laid out the blueprint for a physically based hydrologic response model. It was published in 1969. And over the past decade or two, a number of models, integrated models, have emerged. I've listed some of them here. Many of them have common features in that they take a fully integrated approach, as we do with HydroGeoSphere, in which the relevant surface and subsurface partial differential equations are solved simultaneously. It's been, over the years, a growing area of model development, but one could argue that these models are pretty much been tested in real-world simulations. And do we need more models, or should we be applying them to real-world problems, resolving key societal concerns as well as scientific questions? This is just a brief overview of some of the features within HydroGeoSphere, or HGS. As I mentioned, we solve the diffusion wave equation, a nonlinear equation that looks a bit like Richard's equation over the entire land surface, and it includes stream surface drainage network genesis. And what I mean by that is you may start with a domain which is devoid of surface water, groundwater levels at some arbitrary level, and you apply rainfall to spin up the model, and it'll actually create the network of streams and ponds and wetlands, etc. So it's quite a unique feature. Variably saturated 3D flow in the subsurface based upon Richard's equation, and of course we have embedded within it the handling of evapotranspiration in the usual way, which is dependent on leaf area index, rooting depth, etc., etc. In many of the problems we address, we have to take into account special features such as the presence of macropores near the surface, or fractures within deep geologic rocks. In some of these cases, we, for example, have been working with HydroGeoSphere for the deep, simulating performance of deep geologic repositories for high-level radioactive waste storage. You can take several approaches: dual porosity, dual permeability approach to handle these features, or, if needed, discrete fractures and faults. As I mentioned, for solute transport in both the surface and subsurface regimes, we solve the advection dispersion equations. It will handle reactive solute transport, thermal energy transport, and then snow melting accumulation, soil freeze thaw. Now, it's a control volume finite element model, so you can accommodate complex topography, irregular hydraulic properties, and in some cases, if you're interested in coastal aquifer dynamics, density-dependent flow. As I had mentioned, these are challenging equations to solve. We use Newton iteration to handle the nonlinearities, something called adaptive time stepping and sub-time stepping. What sub-time stepping means is that where water flow, for example, is very rapid, such as near streams, you can use smaller time steps compared to the time steps which may be larger in the subsurface. It has been parallelized for HPC simulation because you want to reduce your simulation time wherever you can. So fully coupled simultaneous solution of the flow and transport equations using a variety of different discretization features and handling irregular meshes. This is just a little bit of an explanation of, I'm sure many of you are familiar with finite element analysis. The diagram on the left is a jet turbine and calculating stresses. You can see a mesh. Well, it's very similar to what we do in the subsurface. And on the right, you can see a simple cross-section involving a prairie pothole type setting where we've applied precipitation. You can see in the subsurface there's a number of geologic layers, and some of these layers are penetrated by fractures. And the colored diagram in the bottom right is showing the response of water saturations, and you can see how the moisture fronts are penetrating into the fractures, and eventually they'll reach the water table and replenish the water table. So this is actually a very challenging problem to solve, and HydroGeoSphere seems to handle it quite well. There was a worldwide user base of HGS with a strong publication record. I don't know, perhaps several hundred papers in the literature, and many of the users are academic users, universities around the world, of some commercial and government users as well. So let's just step through and just look at some of the key equations upon which HGS is built, and I'll go through this quite quickly. Many of you will be familiar with the equations. So in the subsurface, we have Richard's equation in the upper equation, which simply says the divergence of the water flux plus or minus a certain exchange of water between the different domains, such as surface and subsurface, equals change in storage on the right-hand side. We have here Darcy's equation, which includes a relative permeability term and a hydraulic conductivity tensor, and then it's, of course, based on the gradient of the pressure head and elevation head. Over the surface domain, we were showing the diffusion wave equation, again, diversion of the water flux plus or minus source and sink, so water exchange flux equals change in surface water storage. And here we're showing Manning's equation, sort of the analogy to Darcy's equation to describe the flux of water over the surface domain. Now, in the integrated solution, we can see there's this red arrow linking the two gamma naught terms, which is the exchange of water between the surface and subsurface. So the linkage is actually done by that first order exchange. It says the water flux is proportional to, if you will, the head difference between the surface and subsurface regimes, a conductance term, and a relative permeability term. So given this linkage, we can solve those two equations simultaneously throughout the entire computational domain. As far as Solute Transport is concerned, again, the advection dispersion equations, two-dimensional in the surface, three-dimensional in the subsurface. Now we have an omega term, which links the advective dispersive solute fluxes between the two regimes. And so if we look at the bottom equation, that omega naught is simply the concentration times the water flux, gamma naught, exchange between the regimes, plus an additional term which differences the concentration between the surface and subsurface, and alpha naught is basically a diffusion type conductance term. Now we've added in snow melt processes, snow accumulation, and again we're showing the in slightly different form the Richards equation, and the snow accumulation melting term is represented by a first order ordinary differential equation, d by dt of rho snow d snow, that's the mass of snow, and then we have both a melting and an accumulation term, including sublimation. So I won't say anything further about this equation. It's fairly standard. Of course, in the winters, the soil may freeze and may thaw in the spring. So here I'm showing a form of Richards equation, where now on the right-hand side, underlined by red, is the change in the mass, if you will, of ice. And of course, the permeability for water flow is described as a function of the water saturation in this particular equation. I mentioned that HydroGeoSphere can use either structured or unstructured meshes. We like to use in many of our applications unstructured meshes because we can increase the density of elements near water features such as rivers, increase the spacing of the nodes in areas which are flatland, and of course you have a choice of different types of meshes that one can use. Tetrahedra, hexahedra, pentahedra, etc. I just wanted to say a couple of things about why parallelize, and this is an example of a small watershed of a few hundred square kilometers in southern Ontario. We're showing the land covered, land surface using 6 zones in the diagram in the upper left, and a number of subsurface different geologic layers. And on the right-hand side, we're showing our discretization. It's not a particularly large problem, about 250,000 nodes in the mesh. Now, this is basically comparing the performance of HGS with and without parallelization and optimization of numerical control parameters. So you can see that with parallelization, this particular problem, to spin it up to a steady state, applying, let's say, average mean precipitation, took about 1.3 clock hours on a Pentium, or sorry, i7 Extreme computer. That was with only 4 CPUs. However, if you run it in serial mode and not optimize certain numerical control parameters such as Newton iteration parameters, solvers, sparse matrix solver parameters, that very same problem took more than 2 weeks to reach steady state. So the savings in computation time can be immense if you carefully tune your control parameters as well as the number of CPUs that are used. So I'll just close out this section before I hand it over to Dr. Steve Frey, where he'll explore some example problems. But our lessons learned from experiences that integrated models such as HydroGeoSphere are shown, in fact, demonstrated an ability to handle complex hydrologic processes at multiple scales. As you'll see from the examples, the scales we've applied the model to range from a few tens or so of square kilometers to the continental scale. There is also missing data, but we're becoming quite good at estimating data where data is missing. There are still computational challenges, but we here in the Quanti team are up to those challenges in developing newer and better and faster, more robust numerical algorithms. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Frey.
So now what we're going to look at are a number of applications that we've applied HydroGeoSphere to here at Quanti. And these applications range a wide variety of different scales, and we've also looked at water quantity as well as water quality issues. So this is a pretty broad range of typical HGS applications. So the first example we're going to look at is the model we built for the Grand River Basin here in southern Ontario, which is basically where Waterloo is centered. It's a 7,000 square kilometer watershed, and we built the original model to look at climate change impacts on water resources, both surface and groundwater resources within the basin. And because the basin is home to over 1 million people, many of them who rely on groundwater as their principal water resource, as well as a strong agricultural base, there's kind of a mixed use demand on water resources within the basin. So the simulations we looked at have both an agriculture as well as a public sector or a municipal focus. So here's an example of some output from a HydroGeoSphere simulation for the Grand River Basin. As it had been mentioned, we simulate these types of problems over a wide variety of different time scales that range from hours or days to centuries or even longer. What we're seeing here is the simulation of a thunderstorm event that moves across the watershed from the northwest to the southeast. The top right image shows the precipitation front associated with the thunderstorm. Then what we're tracking on the bottom two images are the response of the surface water system to the precipitation. So you see as the precipitation front moves across the watershed, the surface water system lights up, water depths increase, and also we're getting a response in the soil profile as well. So you can see in the bottom animation the soil saturations increase in response to the thunderstorm moving across the basin. And with these types of scenarios, we can test the effects of different antecedent moisture conditions and different storm intensities on the hydrologic response of the system to specific types of precipitation events. So within HydroGeoSphere, we can do a very comprehensive, spatially distributed modeling approach towards estimating evapotranspiration. So what you see here on the left is evapotranspiration that's been simulated using a full modeling approach incorporated within HydroGeoSphere, and you can see a very detailed distribution of different evapotranspiration rates averaged over the course of a year. But also what we've been doing is internally we've been developing smart ways to estimate ET that's much more numerically efficient for watershed scale problems. So what you see here on the right is an inverse method, results from an inverse method that we've developed, where based on the flow rates at gauging stations that each incorporate a certain sub-catchment area from within the larger watershed, we can use the flow rates at the sub-catchment outlets to give us a kind of a broad brush perspective on the spatially distributed evapotranspiration. And you can see as you compare the images on the right with the image on the left, we get a general sense with the inverse estimation method that matches very closely with the full modeled evapotranspiration. So that's some of the examples of some new developments underway here at Quanti with HydroGeoSphere. So we also do contaminant movement. And again, we're still looking at an application within the Grand River watershed. And what we're doing is we're going to see the movement of discharge from a wastewater treatment plant that emits into the Grand River, and ultimately the Grand River flows into Lake Erie. And up here in North America, Lake Erie is at high risk of eutrophication, and it suffers from algae issues associated with point source as well as non-point source loads of nutrients. So what we're going to see here is how HydroGeoSphere can be used to track the cumulative loading of different constituents that may be emitted from facilities like wastewater treatment plants or also agricultural inputs. So here are the simulation results. And what we're looking at here on the left is a pulse discharge from the wastewater treatment plant that's located near the middle of the watershed. And you can see as that pulse moves through the basin from its release point down to the outlet at Lake Erie, we get a dilution of the contaminants as a result of additional flow inputs that come from surface water sources as well as subsurface. Because we have to remember in these simulations we're tracking not only the surface water influences, but also the groundwater surface water interactions. Now what we're seeing here on the right is a source of contaminant that is initiated and then continues to flow. So with this type of a source, we have a continuous buildup of concentrations along the river reach. And then over time, the only real changes in concentrations that occur are in response to changes in flow rates, which are related to changes in surface water or groundwater inputs along the river reach. So there are two different contaminant loading scenarios that we can incorporate within HGS simulations. So now we're going to look at another finer scale example of how HydroGeoSphere is used to track groundwater surface water interactions. So again, we're still in the Grand River watershed, but now we're in a small subcatchment. And you can see this area is on the order of about 10 to 15 square kilometers. There's been a detailed HydroGeoSphere model built for it, which has been used for both flow and contaminant transport simulations. So what we're going to look at here is a patch source of contaminant applied to an agricultural field located in the vicinity of a stream channel. So this contaminant source is represented as a first type solute boundary condition with an initial concentration of 1. And you can see here the discretization of the domain with the number of geologic layers underlying a fairly complex surface topology. So here we are at time 0, and what we've got is a contaminant source on the field. And over time, with kind of an annual rainfall average of about 0.36 meters per year, we see that this contaminant source will migrate. And now looking at the surface perspective, we see the migration of the contaminant along the field boundary, but also if you look closely, we see the contaminant emerging on the stream channel, and then over time, the concentrations build up in the stream channel. So if we remember now that we're looking at this over time, we can see at a certain point, we reach a steady state solute concentration at the outlet to that subcatchment that we're simulating. So what we initially saw was the surface perspective of that contaminant source. But what's very interesting from the groundwater surface water interaction perspective is how that contaminant moves through the subsurface to get to the stream. So now what we're going to do is look at a cross section through this model domain where we have the patch source shown on the surface, and then over time we will see how that patch source migrates through the soil profile and gets into the shallow groundwater system and then ultimately out into the stream. So here we are after 1 year. We're moving the contaminant down through the soil profile. It's slowly moving out towards the stream channel. By 2 years, we're getting very close to an emergence of the contaminant at the stream channel. And by year 3, you can see how the contaminant has moved through the soil profile down into shallow groundwater and now is emerging out on the bank of the river. And as we move over time, the concentrations increase until they reach a quasi-steady state condition. So now we're going to move to another example we've looked at here in great detail at Aquanti. This is the Athabasca River Basin, which is located up in northern or north central Alberta, and it's a very famous river basin because it basically hosts the Canadian oil sands operations. So this model was built to look at the issues relating to long-term water resources sustainability, and we've built a model that has then been coupled with climate change simulations to look at the water resources of both groundwater and surface water resources under a number of different climate change scenarios. So you can see the types of climate data sets that are available to run these models. These integrated models are primarily driven by climate data. So we often use data from the Climate Research Unit at East Anglia University, and this will give us an ability to regenerate historic conditions. So we'll calibrate to historic conditions. And then after we've got our calibrated model, we start looking at climate change scenarios. So here on the bottom right, what you see is a number of different WRF scenarios, weather research and forecasting tool. was used to get high resolution future climate and weather conditions for the Athabasca River Basin. And within HydroGeoSphere, we've incorporated these climate change scenarios to run different perspectives or different simulations to look at how the different climate change scenarios will influence the groundwater and surface water resources. And you can see with a number of different climate change scenarios, we get a fairly broad range of different future stream flow conditions in the river. So if we look at that in more detail and how our calibrated model ultimately evolved, when we first started calibrating this model, we had results that basically are shown here on the right, where the red is the simulated stream flow at Fort McMurray, which is in the heart of the oil sands operations, and the observed stream flow. And first cut, the calibrations don't look all that great. But one of the benefits we have here at Quanti, not only do we use the model, we also evolve it and further develop it. So with the skill we have here in-house, we went and we looked at winter processes, as well as the hydraulic characteristics of peatland soils in greater detail. We wrote new algorithms to better represent the physics underlying these processes. And upon the implementation and testing of the new modules, we see that we were able to match the simulated stream flows at Fort McMurray very closely with the actual observed data. So this is without a lot of model torturing. This is just by upgrading the physics within the model. And once the model is calibrated, and then we start looking at the future conditions, we see that there's a lot of uncertainty, of course, with climate change scenarios and incorporating climate change scenarios into the hydrologic modeling. But one potential case that we see from the modeling is that the stream flows at Fort McMurray are going to be reduced by half. So it's not necessarily a certain outcome, but it's definitely possible. So now we're going to move to a local scale modeling example. So this is a very detailed agricultural model that we built. It encompasses about 8 square kilometers. And at this level of detail, we take into account a highly variable soils distribution, both superficially as well as vertically. Very detailed topography. So this model was built using 1 meter resolution LiDAR data. And we also have very detailed subsurface geology. And we can build even detail for the individual field boundaries. We track where the laneways and drainage ditches are. That becomes a very detailed representation of the real world. So within this model, we also put in individual land use for the individual fields with individual cropping patterns. We also put in macropores. So from the surface down to tile drain depth, which is about 0.8 meters down to about 1 meter, we've got a macroporous, about 4 macroporous soil layers. Overall, the model domain is about 4 meters thick. And you can see with the LiDAR topography, we're actually picking up very detailed surface flow characteristics that at this scale actually influence the surface water flow characteristics at the outlet of the basin. So we also discretely represented tile drains within this model. And in fact, there's 27,000 individual one-dimensional line elements discretized into the model, and tile drains are so this is a very high level of detail for tile drain modeling. And generally, tile drains are kind of homogenated into the model domain with some simplification practices, but here we've incorporated them all discretely. And you can see this is what our mesh looks like. So we have a finer discretization along the surface water flow channels, and the discretization also aligns with field boundaries and tile drain orientations as well. So in total, this model has about 566,000 nodes, close to 1 million elements, and it's consisted of 8 layers, 4 of which are macroporous. So once we have a model like that built and calibrated, here's an example of what we can use it for. So we looked at landscape sensitivity. So with tile drains, you can see under an average steady state condition, the depth of the water table roughly matches topography, and it's influenced by the depth of the tile drains. So the tile drains control water table position. Now what we can do is take the tile drains out of the model to generate the historic behavior of that catchment. And lo and behold, once the tile drains are removed from the model, we see that that land area essentially becomes wetland, with the water table emerging at ground surface across much of the area. And this matches very close with what we know about that region 130 years ago, where in fact it was a wetland before the early settlers put in tile drains. So the types of model outputs that we can extract for those types of models, we can, like say, track water table locations and water table positions over time. This can be highly transient data output from the model. Soil saturations, spatially varied across the catchment. Again, it can be highly transient, as well as detailed evapotranspiration. That's a function of the soils, the land use, the cropping patterns, and information like that. So now with that type of model built, we can also use it for nutrient transport simulation. So here what we're going to see is the effects of a liquid swine manure application on one field within that model domain, and how the swine manure can migrate off of the field surface and into the surface water channels. So this is an animation showing the initial manure application, and then over a short period of time with some precipitation, that manure is driven off the field surface via surface runoff and into the surrounding drainage channels. What that allows us to do is look at potentially threshold concentrations along the drainage ditch. So from an ecological perspective, there may be a threshold concentrations that we want to stay below. So we can use this type of modeling tool then to assess what your concentrations could be at an edge of field site or down at a watershed outlet. And you can see the concentrations drop as the pulse moves through the catchment, and also there's a lag time associated with the arrival of the pulse depending on where you are through the catchment. So now we're going to move to another large project that we're doing here at Quanti. It's focused on the South Saskatchewan River Basin, which is a mixed-use watershed out in southern Alberta. There's a lot of agriculture. It's bounded by the Rocky Mountains, which makes the hydrologic characteristics unique in the sense that the surface water and groundwater flow patterns are heavily influenced by the presence of the mountains and the snow accumulations and snow melting that goes along with the mountain range. And also this is an area that's prone to both flooding and droughts. So you can see up in the right, this is the South Saskatchewan River Basin, kind of in the heart or the western heart of North America. So project overview, we're going to build a number of hydrologic models for the South Saskatchewan River Basin, where we look at both the sub-basins in great detail, but also regional models that will be driven by information that we're gleaning from the sub-basin scale models, and the sub-basin scale models are themselves fed from information we're gleaning from the basin scale models. With this modeling tool, once it's developed, it's going to be used for flood risk assessment, drought risk assessment, and also conditions that depend on soil moisture thresholds. So you don't necessarily have to have floods or droughts to influence agriculture. You can have waterlogged soils that may lead to conditions where farmers can't get on to seed or harvest. These types of tools can also be used to look at flood mitigation strategies and allow us to test mitigation strategies before any on-the-ground engineering is conducted. So as I mentioned, we're looking at a number of different scales for this project. These will ultimately be nested models that share data between themselves. We'll start with the major river basin, which is at the order of 150,000 square kilometers. From there, we'll model the 4 major subbasins. So here's an example of the southernmost subbasin. It's about 30,000 square kilometers. It'll be modeled in more detail. And from within this subbasin model, we'll extract regional areas where we'll look at it in even greater detail. And from the regional models, we'll actually be able to zoom in to individual fields to look at very detailed cycling of soil moisture under different climatic conditions and under different cropping conditions to really get a handle on drought and flood risks across the agricultural landscape in this basin. So here what we are, this is some preliminary work we've done with the basin scale model, where we've tested a very heavy precipitation event on the model to see how the surface water system responds. So here you can see under 20 centimeters of rain per day over a period of 2 days, which is enough precipitation to initiate a major flood in this basin, we actually can observe very subtly the surface water response to that particular event. But what we're generating here is a series of boundary conditions that can be used to drive higher resolution modeling where the response of the surface water system becomes more pronounced. So here we're going to look at one of the major subbasins under the same event with some boundary conditions that are imported from the basin scale model. And here you can see with the same precipitation, we're getting a much more pronounced response of the surface water flow system to the same precipitation event. Now we can keep zooming in. So now we're going to look at a local scale simulation of two rivers and the confluence of those two rivers up above municipal area. So what we're actually tracking here is the movement of the flood wave across the topography in response to that precipitation event. And here we're actually looking at boundary conditions that are imported from the sub-basin scale model. And we can see based on the topography, we don't get a lot of overland flooding in response to that event within the municipal areas. But what we do generate is saturated soils and even standing water in some of the surrounding agricultural areas. So you can see the red dots that are definitely away from the main river channel. These red dots and blotches, they represent standing water that's being generated. And these areas actually can lead to significant crop losses and insurance claims. So we can continue to zoom in. So now we're looking at a different municipal area within the South Saskatchewan River Basin. But under the same precipitation event now, we can actually generate essentially what is an urban flood map. So now what we're taking is a hydrograph that's being generated from the basin scale model and feeding that stream flow into a HydroGeoSphere model that is built on very accurate LiDAR topography. And with very accurate topography, we can get a very accurate perspective on where the water is going to flow under that specific scenario. So here you can see what we essentially generate at the maximum point of flooding is a flood map for a given scenario for a detailed area within the major basin. So we had also mentioned we can use HydroGeoSphere for assessing flood mitigation strategies. So oftentimes rivers have to be protected to protect the floodplains from inundation. So you can see on the top right animation is a river stage response to a flood wave moving through a specific channel. This is an unprotected channel. As you can see, the flood stage increases to the point where the floodplain is inundated. Now what we can do is take out the real world topography, which could potentially be represented in the top animation, and we can put in a design topography that reflects some engineering changes. In this case, it's a berm. And what we see here is that this berm, with its designed height, is able to mitigate the overland flooding on the floodplain within this channel in response to this specific hydrograph. But also what we see is the influence of the groundwater table and the groundwater table rise that's associated with that hydrograph. So in the unprotected river channel animation, we see a fairly broad groundwater table rise that matches the floodplain elevation to a certain extent. And with the protected river channel, we're getting a water table rise, but it's more focused along the river channel because we don't have the inundation of the ground surface across the floodplain. So this is a pretty neat way to look at the influence of potential groundwater induced flooding in a floodplain area. So now I'll pass it back to Dr. Sudicky, and he'll take us through the last example where HydroGeoSphere has been applied at the national scale here in North America.
Yeah, this is work that was recently completed by a PhD student of mine. He finished in the spring, and we're in the process of preparing the papers. And in his work, he applied HydroGeoSphere at the scale of the entire Canadian landmass, which you can see outlined here in blue. And there was a lot of work done in collecting hydrogeological information of the land surface and subsurface across the Canadian landmass, working with quaternary geologists and so on. So it's a fully 3D HGS model, and the idea was to make some projections of what might occur towards middle and end century, and these projections are based on climate change scenarios conducted by a colleague of mine and his team. So it's a very large domain, again, 3 dimensions. This slide just shows you a little piece of the 3D prism finite element meshes, and again we use unstructured meshes, concentrating the density of nodes within the mesh where we expect larger hydraulic responses. In total, the mesh contains about a little less than 2 million prism finite elements. This just shows a simulation which we spun up the model to present-day conditions, present-day average climatic conditions, and we're showing here the depth of the water table. And there are data for which we can compare the model, but overall what we found is the calculations of the depth of the water table are quite similar to what we observe near and around the Hudson Bay lowlands. It's essentially at surface. Here in southern Ontario, surrounded by the Great Lakes, the water table is on average a few meters or so in depth, a little deeper in western Canada and the southern prairie provinces, and of course deeper again in the Rocky Mountain area. So what was done in the PhD work was to make a number of climate projections using several different climate, regional scale climate models, one being the Canadian Regional Climate Model, another being the WRF model, and the third being the Hadley model. And we're showing here what we've calculated with HGS for these different periods, the depth of the water table computed by HydroGeoSphere. So one of the things that is quite noticeable is that different climate models produce different results. There's certainly a lot of uncertainty, but there are also similarities. For example, when we compare the Canadian Regional Climate Model driven results to the WRF driven results from mid-century, you can see that in southwestern prairie provinces, the water table generally becomes somewhat deeper, on the order of a couple or so meters, which may have a lot of bearing on agriculture production into the future. There are many other measures that we computed with HydroGeoSphere, including changes in river flows across Canada, changes in lake levels, and those results will appear in the publications when we complete them. So this ends our webinar presentation. I want to thank you all for your attention, and I believe you will have our coordinates, and some of you have follow-up questions in the future. So thank you again.